After my father's business failed, my parents sent me away, keeping my brother, as I was considered a better match for my uncle's family. But when I reunited with them 10 years later at Grandma's 75th birthday, their jaw-dropping reactions were unforgettable due to how much I had progressed. Back when I was just a teenager, my family experienced a devastating loss. My dad, who at the time was a successful businessman, started facing enormous financial troubles. At one point, his business partner even ran away with some of the company's funds, making it impossible for my dad to keep the business afloat any longer. In the end, he was forced to shut down the business completely. My father had always been a very proud man and took immense pride in his business. However, when he suddenly lost his only source of income, it made him absolutely depressed. He had always been a pillar of strength for our family, the one we all looked up to not just for his hard work and dedication, but for the way he carried himself with dignity and grace in everything he did. His business wasn't just a source of income, it was a reflection of his dreams, his aspirations, and all the years of effort he had invested. When it crumbled, it felt like more than just a financial loss. It was as if a part of him had been taken away. For our family, this loss was not just about the money or the business itself, it was about the uncertainty that followed. Watching my father transform from the cheerful, happy man I had always known into someone who was short-tempered and constantly agitated was one of the most painful experiences of my life. It was as if the weight of his loss had drained him of the very qualities that had defined him for so long. I vividly remember those dark days when he would spend entire days in bed, a stark contrast to the energetic man he used to be. He would only come out to eat, and even then, it was a quick, almost mechanical routine before he retreated back to the solitude of his room. He seemed to have lost all interest in life outside of his bedroom. My mom would try her best to lift his spirits. She would gently urge him to get out of bed, suggesting that he find some hobbies or even just go for a walk to clear his mind. She hoped that maybe a distraction could help pull him out of the deep sadness he was sinking into. But instead of the hopeful response she was looking for, my dad would often snap at her, telling her to leave him alone. The frustration and pain in his voice were palpable, and it was clear that he was grappling with emotions he didn't know how to handle. During this difficult time, my mom became the sole provider for our family. She was a nurse at a local hospital, and while she had always been committed to her work, the financial strain of my dad's business collapse meant that she had to take on even more. The bills were piling up, and the rent was overdue. There was no choice. She had to pick up extra shifts at the hospital, often working long hours just to keep us afloat. It was hard to see her stretch herself so thin, juggling the demands of her job while also trying to hold our family together emotionally. She never complained, but I could see the exhaustion in her eyes and the weight on her shoulders. She was carrying so much, and I admired her strength, even as I worried about how long she could keep it up. The atmosphere at home during that time was always heavy, thick with an unspoken tension that lingered in every corner of the house. My younger brother Michael and I did our best to avoid anything that might anger our parents, especially our dad, whose mood had become so unpredictable. Michael was always the smarter one between the two of us, the kind of kid who was naturally gifted when it came to academics. He was a bit of a nerd, the type who loved burying his nose in books and solving complex problems for fun. In contrast, while I did well in school, my interests extended beyond just studying. I was passionate about basketball and had a few other hobbies that I enjoyed, which meant my grades weren't quite on Michael's level, but I always did my best, and up until that point, my mom had never had any issues with it. She regularly kept track of my grades and understood that we were different, valuing the effort we each put into our pursuits. However, as my dad began spending more and more time at home, the dynamics in our family began to change. He suddenly had a newfound interest in our grades and would make comments about how I clearly wasn't working as hard as Michael, pointing out the differences in our academic achievements. I remember him saying things like, "If you're not going to be the best, then what's the point of even studying? Stop going to school." His words hurt a lot, not just because they were mean, but because they clearly came from his own pain and failure after the loss of his business. It was as if he was projecting his feelings of inadequacy and loss onto me. It hurt to see him so disillusioned and to feel like I was somehow contributing to his unhappiness, even though I knew deep down that wasn't the case. I tried to focus on my studies more, hoping to impress my dad, but it was just never enough. If my mom ever showed any appreciation for my grades, my dad would quickly undermine it with taunts, insisting that there was nothing to be proud of when the grades could be much better. At first, my mom would try to defend me, reminding him that I was doing my best and that every achievement, no matter how small, deserved recognition. But as time went on and as my dad's taunts grew more frequent and intense, something changed. Slowly, she started to join in with him, echoing his comparisons between me and Michael. They both began to tell me almost daily how much better my younger brother was doing than me and how I needed to step it up if I wanted to keep up with him in life. My dad would remind me almost every day how I was always lesser than Michael. The comparisons felt relentless, and they started to seep into every aspect of my life. Eventually, they even banned me from any after-school activities, including playing basketball. They told me that if I wanted to do better in school, I needed to concentrate solely on my studies. So I was forced to give up the sport I loved, the one thing that allowed me to feel free and happy, and devote all my time to schoolwork just so I could be as brilliant as my brother. However, as my parents' restrictions tightened, I began to feel trapped in my own home. I was constantly on edge, waiting for the next criticism or comparison. I started to feel depressed, overwhelmed by the sense that no matter what I did, it would never be enough. There was no time for rest or relaxation. It was just a continuous cycle of studying and worrying to avoid confrontation. My dad would check up on me constantly, making sure I was studying. Even if I had already finished all my assignments, he would make me feel guilty if I even took a short break. The pressure was suffocating, and it made it hard to focus on anything, let alone enjoy the things I used to love. I became so jittery around my parents that I started recognizing them by the sound of their footsteps. If I heard my dad coming up to my room, I would immediately scramble to cover my comic book with a textbook, pretending to be studying even when I had nothing left to study. I was terrified of being caught wasting time and afraid that he would accuse me of being lazy or not taking my studies seriously. The constant fear of disappointing them, of being compared unfavorably to Michael, consumed me. This fear and anxiety boiled into every part of my life. I felt like I was walking on eggshells, never knowing when the next criticism would come or what I would be accused of next. I began to lose interest in everything, even the subjects I used to enjoy, because they were now just another source of stress. The joy I once found in learning and in playing basketball was gone, replaced by a deep sense of inadequacy and guilt. I became a shadow of who I once was, constantly striving for an approval that seemed more and more unattainable. And even though I was doing everything they asked, studying harder, giving up my hobbies, and trying to be the perfect student, I never felt like it was enough. The more I tried to meet their standards, the more distant and disconnected I felt from them and from myself. A year into my dad's business going under, our family was still caught in a downward spiral. My dad hadn't been able to find a new job, and my mom was working herself to the bone trying to keep everything together while the bills kept piling up. And that's when my grandmother came to visit. I think she must have noticed right away how different our lives had become. We had once lived comfortably, with everything we needed and more, but now it felt like we were just scraping by, struggling to make it through each day. I didn't know it at the time, but I think my grandmother had a serious talk with my parents about our situation. She must have seen the toll it was taking on all of us, especially on my mom, who was working endless hours, and on my dad, who was still grappling with the loss of his business and a sense of self-worth. The very next day after my grandmother's visit, my parents sat me down for a talk. I could tell right away that something was different. There was a seriousness in their expressions that made my stomach drop. They told me that they had been talking and had come to a difficult realization. They were struggling too much to take care of both me and my brother. I was taken aback, not fully understanding what they were trying to say. I asked them what they meant, my heart pounding in my chest. My dad looked at me with a heaviness in his eyes that I had never seen before, and he explained that my grandmother had suggested a solution, one that neither of them wanted to consider but felt they had to. She had pointed out that my uncle, who didn't have any children of his own, had always wanted to be a father. He and his wife had a stable life and would be happy to look after one of us to ease the burden on my parents and give one of us a better chance at stability. I looked confused as I heard this. My mom then chimed in, her voice trembling as she spoke. She told me that because Michael was the youngest and more academically inclined, they believed it was best for him to stay with them so that his education wouldn't be disrupted. They said they wanted me to go and live with my uncle, where I could have a fresh start, and they could focus on taking care of Michael. Hearing this, I felt like the ground had been pulled out from under me. I was shocked and hurt. It felt like a rejection, like they were choosing Michael over me and deciding that he was more worthy of their care and attention just because he was more talented than me. I couldn't understand why they would send me away, Why they thought it was okay to separate our family like this. I had always done my best despite everything that had happened, and now it seemed like none of that mattered. I started to cry and asked them if they didn't love me anymore, promising that I would work harder on getting better grades. But my dad shook his head and told me that they just didn't have the money to support 2 kids and assured me that I was a better match for my uncle's family anyway. My mom tried to explain how, as the older sibling, I would adapt more easily to a new environment and how this was an opportunity for me to have better support. They tried to frame it as something positive, but all I could feel was a deep sense of abandonment. I didn't know how to cope with that. My parents were clearly torn too, and I could see that this decision wasn't easy for them, but it didn't make it hurt any less. In the end, I had no choice but to pack my bags and move to my uncle's place when he came to pick me up. The day he arrived, the reality of the situation finally sank in, and the weight of what was happening became almost unbearable. I remember crying a lot when it was time to say goodbye to my brother, even though I knew I would still see him occasionally. The finality of leaving home, of being separated from my family, was overwhelming. My mom hugged me tightly, tears streaming down her face, and whispered that she loved me and that this was for the best. My dad gave me a stiff hug, his eyes avoiding mine. I could sense the sadness and regret in their embrace. It didn't ease the hurt. I knew they were struggling and that they thought they were making the best decision for everyone, but that knowledge didn't make the goodbye any easier. When I arrived at my uncle's place, it felt both familiar and strangely foreign at the same time. I was comfortable around my uncle and his wife. They had always been kind and welcoming, and I had spent considerable time with them over the years. But this time, things were different. This wasn't just a visit. This was my new home. They did everything they could to make me feel welcome, setting up a room for me and encouraging me to decorate it however I liked. They were patient and understanding, giving me space when I needed it and company when I felt lonely. Despite their efforts, the first few weeks were tough. I missed my home, the sounds of my mom cooking in the kitchen, my brother moving around next door, and even the creaks of the floorboards that I had come to know so well. I missed my parents despite everything that had happened. The hurt was still fresh, but there was a deep part of me that longed for the comfort and familiarity of my family. As the months went by, I made an effort to adjust and make the best of the situation. My uncle and his wife were incredibly supportive, and they went out of their way to help me feel at home. It wasn't easy at first. There were moments when I felt lost and out of place, but gradually I started to find my footing. That encouraged me to pursue my interests and passions, and for the first time in a long while, I felt free to explore what truly made me happy. I rejoined the basketball team at my new school and reconnected with my love for the sport. My uncle and aunt attended every game they could, cheering me on from the sidelines. Their support meant the world to me. I also found new friends who shared my interests, and school became a place of excitement rather than anxiety. My grades improved, not because of pressure or fear, but because I was genuinely engaged and interested in what I was learning. With time, I began to heal from the pain of feeling abandoned by my parents. I still kept in touch with them, but our conversations were brief and infrequent. They seemed preoccupied with Michael and his achievements, and while that used to bother me, I started to accept that their priorities were different. I focused on building my own path and embracing the opportunities that came my way. Years passed, and I continued to thrive under my uncle and aunt's care. They became like second parents to me, and I was grateful for the love and support they had given me. I graduated from high school with honors and received a scholarship to a prestigious university. My uncle and aunt were there to celebrate with me, beaming with pride. When I went off to college, I chose to study business management, inspired by my own experiences and a desire to understand the world that had once brought my father so much joy and pain. College was an incredible experience. I made lifelong friends, explored new interests, and gained knowledge that would shape my future. I stayed involved in basketball, playing on the college team and balancing sports with academics. During this time, I heard less and less from my parents. Michael and I stayed in touch occasionally, but even our conversations became sporadic. He was struggling academically, and there was talk of him not getting into the universities he had hoped for. It was ironic. The pressure that had once been on me had shifted to him, and I felt a pang of empathy for what he might be going through. After college, I landed a job at a reputable company and began building my career. I worked hard, climbing the ranks, and eventually moved into a senior managerial position. My success was a testament to the support and encouragement I had received from my uncle and aunt, who had always believed in me. 2 years ago, I achieved one of my biggest dreams by purchasing my own home. While I haven't gotten married or had children yet, I've chosen to spend my money on myself and the things that make me happy. I haven't forgotten about my uncle and aunt. I regularly keep in touch with them and make sure to send them money as a token of my gratitude. Meanwhile, Michael reached out to me for financial support, asking if I could invest in his business. Even though I didn't have detailed information about his business plan, I decided to invest in it blindly. My primary motive was to show my support for Michael. I understood how tough the situation was for him and wanted to help him get back on his feet. Fortunately, his business venture was a success, and he's now doing well for himself. Recently, my grandmother's 75th birthday was approaching, and she planned a big celebration, inviting all her children and grandchildren. She insisted that I attend, as we hadn't seen each other in a while. I agreed and decided to attend the party, which was hosted at my parents' place. I drove my new car and arrived in style, reflecting the comfortable and successful life I have built for myself. My parents, who hadn't seen me in a while, greeted me with a warm hug. My mom awkwardly welcomed me, which was nice. My dad, on the other hand, seemed more reserved. He nonchalantly started asking questions about my job and position, and I could see the surprise in their eyes as I shared the details with them. I mentioned that I had even bought a house for myself, which took my dad by surprise. He immediately scoffed and expressed disbelief that I could afford such a place on my own. I felt a familiar sting, but decided to stand up for myself. I calmly responded, "Dad, I understand that you might find it hard to believe, given how things were when I was younger. But I've worked really hard to get where I am today. I've been successful in my career and have made smart financial decisions. I know you and Mom always compared me to Michael and believed he was the more talented one, but I've carved out my own path." My mom interjected, saying, "We always knew you had potential. We just wanted the best for both of you." I looked at her and replied, "I appreciate that, but it didn't feel that way back then. Regardless, I'm not here to dwell on the past. I'm here to celebrate Grandma's birthday and to reconnect." Throughout the party, I mingled with relatives and caught up with family members I hadn't seen in years. Many congratulated me on my success, which seemed to irk my dad. At one point, he pulled me aside and said, "Don't let all this go to your head. Remember where you came from." I looked at him and said, "Dad, I haven't forgotten where I came from. In fact, it's a big part of what motivates me. But I won't let anyone, including you, diminish what I've achieved." He seemed taken aback by my assertiveness. After the party, my mom called me and expressed how my words had hurt my dad. She asked me to apologize to him for disrespecting him, saying my words left him feeling embarrassed. She insisted I had no right to point out that he still depended on Mom for money. In turn, I refused to back down and apologize. I decided to write an email to my parents detailing how I felt about them all these years and how disappointed I am that they never apologized. I recounted each and every incident where they had failed me as parents. I told them how desperately I needed them as a child, yet now I couldn't care less about their existence, since they had always preferred Michael over me. I expressed that their reasons no longer matter to me because our relationship is beyond repair. I no longer consider them as my parents. This deeply upset my mother, and she repeatedly asked me to let things go so we could start afresh. In the meantime, my dad hasn't made any effort to contact me, though my mom did mention that he was emotional after reading my email. I can only hope he feels at least some remorse for what he did to me years ago. For now, I have chosen to maintain a distance from my parents and focus on the life I've built, a life filled with happiness, success, and people who truly care about me. As for my uncle and aunt, I've planned a surprise trip for them to one of their dream destinations. My aunt has talked about this place for years, and I'm excited to share this experience with them. Their unwavering support and love have been a cornerstone in my life, and I want to give back to them in any way I can.